If you hear your name called 3 times, do not answer, because in South Korea, people believe that's how death finds you. And tonight, we're diving into 3 terrifying encounters with something known as the Jeoseung Saja, a figure said to appear right before you die. A nurse sees a man outside a patient's room. An hour later, the patient is dead. A taxi driver picks up a passenger who was never alive. And a student wakes up, unable to move, with something calling a dead man's name from the corner of his room. Our first account takes place in the heart of Seoul, inside one of the city's largest and most prestigious university hospitals. Hospitals at night are inherently unsettling places. The bustling energy of the daytime shifts into a heavy, clinical silence, broken only by the hum of fluorescent lights, the squeak of rubber soles on linoleum floors, and the rhythmic, synthetic beeping of heart monitors. For Ji-yoon, a registered nurse in her late 20s, the night shift in the intensive care unit was a familiar, if exhausting, routine. She had been working the graveyard shift for nearly 3 years, a schedule that left her perpetually drained, existing in a permanent state of jet lag. The ICU ward she oversaw was a place where the veil between life and death was incredibly thin. Patients here were often in critical condition, hovering on the very edge of existence. Ji-yoon was used to the reality of death. It was a clinical outcome, a flat line on a screen, a flurry of activity, and then the quiet process of preparing a body for the morgue. She did not believe in ghosts. She relied on science, medicine, and protocol. But what happened on a freezing Tuesday night in late November shattered her pragmatic worldview entirely. It was around 3 in the morning, the time of night when the human body naturally wants to shut down, and the hospital corridors feel the most isolated. The heating system was struggling against the bitter cold outside, leaving the ward with a distinct, uncomfortable chill. Ji-yoon was at the central nurses' station, updating patient charts by the glow of a computer monitor. The ward was unusually quiet. Most of the patients were heavily sedated or sleeping peacefully. As she typed, she caught a movement in her peripheral vision. She looked up, expecting to see one of the junior nurses, or perhaps a doctor on call. Instead, she saw a man standing at the far end of the long, dimly lit corridor. He was incredibly tall, standing completely motionless just outside the doorway of room 412. The first thing that struck Ji-yoon as wrong was his attire. Visitors were strictly prohibited in the ICU at this hour, and even if they were allowed, this man was dressed in a pristine, immaculately tailored black suit that looked entirely out of place in a hospital setting. The suit was so dark it seemed to absorb the weak fluorescent light around it, but it was his face that made Ji-yoon's breath catch in her throat. His skin was the color of old parchment, devoid of any pink or warm undertones. It was a stark, unnatural white, contrasting sharply with his jet black hair and lips that were so dark they appeared bruised. He was staring directly into room 412. The patient in that room was an elderly man named Mr. Choi, who had been admitted a week prior with severe respiratory failure. He was stable but fragile. Ji-yoon stood up, her nurse instincts kicking in despite the sudden, icy dread pooling in her stomach. She assumed he was a confused relative who had somehow bypassed security. She called out to him, keeping her voice low but firm, asking him to identify himself and explaining that visiting hours were over. The man did not react. He did not flinch, turn his head, or acknowledge her presence in any way. He simply stood there, his posture unnaturally rigid. Annoyed and slightly unnerved, Ji-yoon stepped out from behind the station and began walking down the corridor toward him. She blinked, and in the fraction of a second her eyes were closed, the man vanished. He didn't run away or step into the room. He simply ceased to be there. The hallway was completely empty. A cold sweat broke out on the back of Jeeun's neck. She hurried to room 412 and looked through the glass pane of the door. Mr. Choi was asleep, his chest rising and falling in time with the steady rhythm of the ventilator. Everything was normal. Jeeun tried to shake off the encounter, chalking it up to severe sleep deprivation. She knew that working nights could play tricks on the mind, causing microsleeps and visual hallucinations. She returned to her desk, poured herself a strong cup of black coffee, and forced herself to focus on the paperwork. An hour passed. It was now 4 a.m. Suddenly, the jarring, high-pitched alarm of the cardiac monitor in room 412 shattered the silence. It was a code blue. Mr. Choi's heart had stopped. Ji-yoon and the on-call medical team rushed into the room, initiating CPR and administering emergency medications. The atmosphere was chaotic, a desperate fight to pull the man back from the brink. Despite their frantic efforts, 20 minutes later, the doctor called the time of death. As the team slowly filed out of the room, leaving Ji-yoon to begin the post-mortem care, the temperature in the room plummeted. It felt as though a freezer door had been left open. Ji-yoon shivered, pulling her scrubs tighter around herself. As she reached out to disconnect the IV lines from Mr. Choi's arm, she felt an overwhelming sensation of being watched. She slowly turned her head toward the corner of the hospital room. Standing there, half concealed in the shadows, was the pale man in the black suit. He was much closer now. She could see the terrifying details of his face. His eyes were entirely black, lacking any white sclera, like polished obsidian stones. His dark lips were slightly parted, and though he did not breathe, a faint, freezing mist seemed to hang in the air around his mouth. He was looking down at Mr. Choi's body with an expression of absolute indifference. Ji-yoon was paralyzed. She wanted to scream, to run out of the room, but her muscles refused to obey her commands. The air in the room felt thick, like wading through deep water, making it impossible to draw a full breath. The man slowly raised his head and locked his pitch-black eyes onto Ji-yoon. The silence in the room stretched out, deafening and absolute. Then, a voice echoed in Ji-yoon's mind. It wasn't a sound heard with her ears, but a cold, metallic whisper that vibrated directly inside her skull. It said her full name. Just once. The sound was devoid of any emotion, yet it carried an immense, crushing weight. The moment the name was spoken, the man dissolved into the shadows, leaving Ji-yoon alone with the deceased patient. She collapsed against the wall, gasping for air, tears streaming down her face. She finished her shift in a state of shock, barely speaking to her colleagues. Ji-yoon resigned from the hospital the very next day. She moved out of Seoul, returning to her parents' home in a quieter southern province, hoping to leave the nightmare behind. But the story does not end there. 2 months after she moved, she was walking home from a local grocery store at dusk. The streets were quiet, the sky painted in bruised shades of purple and gray. As she passed a narrow alleyway, she felt that familiar, bone-deep chill. She stopped and looked into the gloom. Standing at the end of the alley, wearing a traditional black hanbok and a wide-brimmed black gat, was the pale man. He stared at her, his dark lips parting, and that same metallic whisper echoed in her head, calling her name for the second time. Ji-yoon ran all the way home, locking every door and window. She refuses to leave her house after dark now. According to the old beliefs, the Jeoseung Saja calls your name 3 times. Ji-yoon has heard hers twice. She lives every single day in absolute terror, waiting in the silence, wondering when she will hear the third and final call. While hospitals are places where we might expect to encounter the lingering presence of the dead, there are other environments that are just as isolating and just as prone to the supernatural. Our second story takes us out of the city and onto the winding, treacherous mountain roads of Gangwon Province. This region, located in the northeastern part of South Korea, is famous for its dense, ancient forests, steep mountain passes, and heavy, unpredictable fog that rolls in from the East Sea. For Minjun, a veteran taxi driver with over 20 years of experience, these roads were his livelihood. He often took the long-distance fares that younger drivers avoided, knowing that the winding routes through the Taebaek Mountains could be dangerous, especially at night. Minjun was a practical man. He knew every pothole, every sharp curve, and every blind spot on the Miseryong Pass. He wasn't easily spooked, but he always maintained a healthy respect for the mountains. It was mid-October, the time of year when the autumn chill begins to bite and the fog becomes a daily hazard. Minjun had picked up a fare at the Sokcho Inner-City Bus Terminal just past midnight. The passenger was a young man, probably in his early 20s, carrying a small, worn duffel bag. He was quiet, handing Minjun a piece of paper with an address written on it. The destination was a remote village deep in the mountains, accessible only by a poorly maintained secondary road that branched off the main highway. Minjun hesitated, noting the late hour and the thickening mist outside, but the fare was substantial, and he needed the money to help pay for his daughter's university tuition. He nodded, started the meter, and pulled out into the dark. For the first hour, the drive was uneventful. The heater hummed and the radio played a low, static-laced trot song. The passenger in the back seat remained completely silent, staring out the window into the pitch-black night. As they began the steep ascent up the mountain pass, the fog descended. It wasn't just a light mist. It was a thick, opaque wall of white vapor that swallowed the headlights, reducing visibility to less than 10 meters. Minjun slowed the taxi to a crawl, leaning forward, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. The silence in the car became oppressive. The radio signal faded entirely, leaving only the hiss of white noise. "Terrible weather for a drive," Minjun muttered, trying to break the heavy tension in the cabin. The passenger did not reply. Minjun glanced in the rearview mirror. The young man's face was illuminated by the faint green glow of the taximeter. He looked incredibly pale, his skin almost translucent, and his eyes were fixed straight ahead, wide and unblinking. A strange smell began to fill the car. It wasn't the scent of exhaust or the pine trees outside. It was the distinct, heavy odor of damp earth, old incense, and something faintly sweet and rotting, like decaying flowers. Minjun rolled down his window a fraction, hoping to let in some fresh air, but the fog seemed to seep into the car, bringing the cold with it. They reached the crest of the mountain and began the descent. The road here was notorious. It hugged the side of the mountain with a sheer drop into a rocky ravine on the right side, guarded only by a rusted metal barrier. As they navigated a sharp, blind curve, Minjun saw something that made him slam on the brakes. The taxi skidded on the damp asphalt, coming to a halt just inches from the guardrail. Standing in the middle of the road, perfectly still in the swirling fog, were 3 figures. Minjun's heart hammered against his ribs. He squinted through the windshield, his breath fogging the glass. These were not stranded motorists. They were exceptionally tall men, dressed entirely in traditional black hanboks. On their heads, they wore wide-brimmed black gats, the traditional hats worn by noblemen in the Joseon dynasty. Their faces were hidden in the shadow of the brims, but their skin, where it was visible on their hands and necks, was a stark, unnatural white. They stood shoulder to shoulder, blocking the entire width of the narrow road. Panic surged through Minjun. He reached for his phone to call the police, but there was no signal. He looked in the rearview mirror, intending to tell his passenger to lock the doors. The words died in his throat. The young man in the back seat was smiling. It was a wide, unnatural smile that stretched too far across his pale face. "They are here for me," the passenger whispered. His voice sounded distant, echoing as if spoken from the bottom of a deep well. Before Minjun could react, the passenger unbuckled his seatbelt and opened the door. He stepped out into the freezing fog. Minjun yelled for him to stop, to get back in the car, but the young man didn't look back. He walked slowly toward the 3 tall figures standing in the road. As he approached them, the figures parted silently, allowing him to step between them. The tallest of the 3 entities slowly raised a pale, long-fingered hand and placed it on the young man's shoulder. Suddenly, the thick fog rolled over the road in a massive, blinding wave, completely obscuring the windshield. Minjun squeezed his eyes shut, terrified that the figures were going to surround the car next. He sat there in the freezing silence for what felt like hours, listening to the erratic thumping of his own heart. Slowly, the fog began to thin, lifting back up into the forest canopy. Minjun opened his eyes. The road ahead was completely empty. The 3 figures in the black hats were gone. The young passenger was gone. Trembling violently, Minjun grabbed his flashlight and stepped out of the taxi. He walked to the spot where the figures had been standing. There were no footprints on the damp asphalt. He shone the light over the edge of the rusted guardrail, peering down into the black abyss of the ravine. Far below, barely visible through the mist, he saw the mangled, rusted wreckage of a car that had clearly gone over the edge months, perhaps years ago. Minjun slowly walked back to his taxi, his mind reeling. He looked at the piece of paper the passenger had given him. The ink had faded entirely, leaving a blank white square. Minjun drove back down the mountain in complete silence, never reaching the destination. He never drove a taxi at night again. To this day, he wonders who the passenger really was, and more terrifyingly, he wonders if the Jeoseung Saja had actually been standing in the road to stop Minjun from driving off the cliff, or if they had simply used him as a vessel to deliver a lost soul to the edge of the underworld. The answer remains shrouded in the mountain fog. Sometimes you don't have to be on a lonely mountain road or in a hospital ward to encounter the harbingers of death. Sometimes they find you in the most intimate, confined spaces of your own life. Our third and final story takes place in the bustling, student-heavy district of Sinchon in Seoul. Housing in Seoul is notoriously expensive, leading many university students to live in goshiwons. A goshiwon is an extremely small, cramped dormitory-style room, originally designed for students studying for rigorous state exams. These rooms are often no larger than 2 or 3 square meters, barely fitting a single bed and a tiny desk. They are cheap, claustrophobic, and often lack windows. For Tae-ho, a second-year engineering student, a goshiwon was all he could afford. He found a particularly cheap room on the 4th floor of an old, decaying building tucked away in a narrow alley behind the main street. The wallpaper was peeling, the communal bathrooms always smelled of bleach and mildew, and the walls were paper thin, allowing him to hear every cough and footstep of his neighbors. But it was a place to sleep, and Tae-ho spent most of his time at the university library anyway. About 3 weeks after moving in, Tae-ho began to experience severe sleep paralysis. He had never suffered from it before. It started as a heavy, suffocating pressure on his chest, waking him in the dead of night. He would open his eyes to the pitch-black darkness of his windowless room, completely unable to move his arms or legs. His mind was awake, but his body was locked in a terrifying paralysis. During these episodes, he would hear a sound. It was the faint, dry rustling of fabric, like stiff silk dragging across the cheap linoleum floor. At first, Taeho blamed the stress of his upcoming midterms. He researched sleep paralysis, learning about hypnagogic hallucinations and how the brain can conjure terrifying images when caught between wakefulness and sleep. He tried to rationalize the experience, telling himself it was just a chemical misfire in his brain. But the episodes became more frequent, happening almost every single night, and the rustling sound grew louder. One night in late October, the paralysis struck with unprecedented force. Taeho woke up feeling as though a concrete block had been dropped onto his sternum. He gasped, but his vocal cords were paralyzed. The room was dark, illuminated only by the faint amber glow of the hallway light seeping under the gap in the door. As his eyes adjusted to the gloom, he realized he was not alone in the tiny room. Standing in the corner, wedged between the foot of his bed and the tiny desk, was a figure. Because the room was so small, the figure was standing less than 2 feet away from Taeho's face. It was a man, impossibly tall, his head nearly brushing the low ceiling. He was dressed in a traditional black hanbok, the fabric looking heavy and ancient. On his head sat a wide-brimmed black gat, casting a deep shadow over his face. The air in the tiny room grew freezing cold, and the distinct smell of burning incense and damp earth filled Taeho's nostrils, making him want to gag. The figure slowly leaned forward, bending at the waist in a stiff, unnatural motion. As his face came into the faint light, Taeho felt a scream build in his paralyzed throat. The man's skin was the color of chalk, cracked and dry. His eyes were deep, empty voids, and his lips were painted a dark, bruised purple. The entity leaned in so close that Taeho could feel a freezing, breathless chill against his cheek. Then the entity spoke. It was a dry, rasping whisper that sounded like dead leaves scraping against stone. It said a name. Sangcho. Taeho's heart hammered frantically. That wasn't his name. The entity waited a moment in silence, its empty eyes staring unblinkingly at Taeho's terrified face. Then, it whispered the name again, slightly louder. Sangcho. Taeho knew the lore. He knew about the 3 calls of the Jeoseung Saja. He knew that if the entity called the name a 3rd time, the soul would be taken. Taeho wanted to scream out, to tell the pale man that he had the wrong person, that his name was Taeho, not Sangchol, but his jaw was locked tight. The entity hovered over him for what felt like an eternity. Finally, it slowly stood up straight. It looked down at Taeho, and the dark lips curled into a terrifying, knowing smile. The entity slowly faded backward, dissolving into the shadows of the corner until the room was empty once again. The heavy pressure on Taeho's chest vanished, and he shot up in bed, gasping for air, drenched in a freezing sweat. He didn't sleep for the rest of the night. As soon as the sun rose, Taeho went down to the cramped office of the building manager, an elderly man who spent his days watching television and smoking cheap cigarettes. Taeho demanded to know the history of his room. He asked about the name Sangchol. The manager's face went pale, and his hands trembled as he put down his cigarette. He reluctantly admitted that the previous tenant of Taeho's room was a young man named Sangchol. A month before Taeho moved in, Sangchol had died in his sleep in that very bed. The cause of death was officially listed as heart failure, but the manager noted that Sangchol had been complaining of terrible nightmares and a dark figure standing in his room for weeks before he passed away. Taeho packed his bags that morning and abandoned the Goshuwon, forfeiting his deposit. He moved on to a friend's couch, refusing to ever set foot in that building again. He survived, but his peace of mind was destroyed. The entity had called the name twice. It was looking for Songchul. But Taeho is plagued by a dark, unresolved terror. He remembers the way the Jeoseung Saja looked at him before it vanished. That knowing, sinister smile. Taeho wonders if the entity realized its mistake, or if, in the dark logic of the underworld, a soul is simply a soul, and any occupant of that cursed bed will eventually hear the third and final call. So what exactly is the Jeoseung Saja? And why do these specific elements, the black clothing, the pale skin, the calling of the name, appear so consistently in Korean ghost stories? In traditional Korean mythology and shamanism, the afterlife is a complex bureaucracy ruled by King Yomna, the supreme judge of the dead. King Yomna does not collect the souls himself. He dispatches his reapers, the Jeoseung Saja, to the mortal realm. Jeoseung translates to the afterlife, or the underworld, and Saja means envoy or messenger. They are essentially the civil servants of death. The reason they are traditionally depicted wearing black hanboks and the wide-brimmed gat is because during the Joseon dynasty, this was the attire of government officials and royal messengers. The pale skin and dark lips represent the absence of blood and life force. The most chilling aspect of the lore, the calling of the name 3 times, is deeply rooted in ancient Korean burial customs. In a ritual known as chohan, when a person died, a family member would take a piece of the deceased's clothing, climb to the roof of the house, and shout the deceased's name 3 times to the heavens. This was a final, desperate plea for the soul to return to the body before the Jeoseung Saja could drag it away. Over centuries, this ritual morphed into the superstition that the Reaper himself calls your name 3 times to officially sever your tie to the living world. But if we look at these stories through a rational, psychological lens, there are logical explanations. In the case of the hospital nurse, the ICU is an environment of extreme stress, sleep deprivation, and constant exposure to death. Microsleeps and hypnagogic hallucinations are incredibly common among graveyard shift workers. The brain, exhausted and anticipating a traumatic event like a patient flatlining, can project a physical manifestation of death, a cultural archetype like the pale man in black, into reality. For the taxi driver on the mountain road, driving late at night in thick fog can induce a state known as highway hypnosis. The sensory deprivation of the fog, combined with fatigue, can cause the brain to interpret shadows, trees, or even road signs as human figures. The vanishing passenger could be a case of a deeply unsettled mind creating a narrative to explain a near-death experience of almost driving off a cliff. And for the student in the Goshuan, sleep paralysis is a well-documented medical phenomenon. When a person wakes up during the REM stage of sleep, the body remains paralyzed to prevent acting out dreams. The brain, panicked by the inability to move, often hallucinates a threatening presence in the room. The fact that he hallucinated a Jeoseung Saja is simply his subconscious, pulling from the cultural fears he grew up with. The detail about the previous tenant named Songchul could be a terrifying coincidence, or perhaps Taeho had subconsciously heard the manager or a neighbor mention the name before the sleep paralysis began. But what if it isn't just stress, fog, or sleep paralysis? What if the veil between the living and the dead really is that thin, and these messengers walk among us, waiting for the right moment to speak our names? What do you think happened? Let us know in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe for more true ghost stories from across Asia.